In today's gripping story, we'll dive into the case of Frank Bennett, a kind 72-year-old man who decided to fulfill a decades-old dream, buying the sports car that he and his late wife always admired in their youth. But what should have been a day of joy turned into a humiliating experience. He was treated with disdain by dealership employees who judged his simple appearance as a sign of incapability. What those employees didn't know was that they were about to face a surprise that would completely change the course of their lives. Get ready for a story full of twists and turns, proving that appearances can be deceiving and that respect is the foundation of everything. You won't believe what happens the next day, and if you want access to an exclusive selection of real stories that will make you laugh, cry, and reflect, subscribe to the channel right now. Frank Bennett was the kind of person who always made a point to keep things simple. Every morning at 6 a.m., he left his modest home in a quiet Los Angeles neighborhood to go for a walk. He always greeted his neighbors with a genuine smile, as if to say, "Life is good, no matter the challenges." At 72, Frank had a peaceful routine. Since retiring from his job as a mechanic, his life revolved around small tasks and memories of the past. Frank and his wife, Susan, had lived a life full of challenges, but also of special moments. They shared everything, even dreams. One of their favorite dreams was a classic sports car they used to admire when they were young. Every time they passed by the downtown dealership, Frank would jokingly say, "One day we'll drive that car along the coastal road." Susan would laugh and reply, "Are you taking me for a picnic in Malibu, Bennett?" Years went by, and life took its course. Frank lost Susan a decade ago, but that shared dream never left him. He decided that one day he would buy that car. It wasn't just about the vehicle, it was about what it represented, the memories of a life lived with love, companionship, and hope. Frank owned an old 1990 Ford, which he kept running with the care of an artist. To him, that car was a reflection of who he was, someone who valued what he had, no matter how little it was. But now, after so many years, he finally had enough to fulfill that wish he had patiently saved, cutting small luxuries and making a point to set aside part of his retirement income. That particular morning, Frank put on his usual hat, folded the check he had kept in his pocket, and looked at the photo frame in the living room. It was a picture of him and Susan, laughing in front of that same car they had always dreamed of buying. He murmured, "Today's the day, darling. I'm finally bringing it home." Frank had a dream, and now he was just a few steps away from making it come true. But what was supposed to be a milestone experience would turn into something no one could have predicted. Frank Bennett was a man who believed in the value of simple things. Designer clothes, expensive accessories, or any form of ostentation were never part of his life. He preferred worn-out jeans, comfortable shoes, and his trusty plaid flannel shirt, which seemed to be his trademark. That look reflected his essence: practical, humble, and honest. He was the kind of person who, even without saying a word, exuded trustworthiness. On the morning Frank decided to visit the dealership, he didn't change anything about his usual appearance. Before leaving, he grabbed a cloth and gave a quick wipe to the windshield of his old Ford, as he did every morning. "Old-timer, you're still holding up, aren't you?" he said with a smile. Then he looked at the photo of him and Susan again, took a deep breath, and left. When he parked at the luxurious dealership, Frank felt small compared to the grandeur of the place. It was a glass building, with cars gleaming in the showroom like works of art. He opened the door calmly, walking through the showroom. His steps echoed on the immaculate marble floor, and the sound of conversations among the salespeople paused for a moment as all eyes turned to him. Frank noticed how the well-dressed staff, wearing tailored suits, exchanged discreet glances. He even heard a muffled giggle from a group near the reception desk. He walked up to the car of his dreams, stopped in front of it, and admired every detail, ignoring the fact that no one seemed willing to assist him. After a few minutes, he approached the reception desk and, in his calm voice, asked, "Good morning. Could someone help me with information about that car over there?" The receptionist gave him a quick glance, as if evaluating every aspect of his appearance. Without hiding her disdain, she vaguely pointed to a nearby salesperson and said, "Maybe he can help you." Frank politely thanked her and went to the indicated salesperson, who was in the middle of an animated conversation with two colleagues. As Frank approached, the salesperson looked at him with obvious disinterest. "Yes?" he asked, barely concealing his boredom. Frank smiled, pointed to the red sports car, and said, "I'd like some information about that model. I'm interested in buying it." The salesperson's eyes narrowed as if he had just heard something absurd. He looked at his colleagues who were now watching the interaction with mocking smiles. "That car? Are you sure, sir?" "Yes, I am. I've always wanted a car like that." The salesperson let out a short laugh, leaned slightly toward Frank, and with a tone barely masking his disdain said, "Sir, the used cars are just around the corner. Maybe we can find something more within your budget." Frank took a deep breath, keeping his composure. "Thank you, but that's the car I want. I'd like to know the price and payment options." Another salesperson, who was now also observing the scene, murmured something to the group, eliciting muffled laughter. The first salesperson turned back to Frank, this time deciding to be even more direct. "With all due respect, this isn't the kind of store for someone like you." Frank remained silent for a moment, staring at the man. He felt the weight of those words but showed no sign of aggression. "I see," he said calmly. Still standing before the car of his dreams, Frank tried one last time to be taken seriously. He turned to the salesperson, who still wore a cynical smile, and said calmly, "I can pay for this car. In full. I have the check ready." The salesperson paused for a moment, but the mocking tone on his face didn't fade. "In full, huh?" He looked at his colleagues as if seeking approval for what he was about to say. "Well, sir, if that's the case, why don't you take a look at that used model outside? I think it's more your style." The laughter started again. One of the salespeople leaning against the counter quipped, "In full?" "Sure, sir. Did you bring cash, or is it a pretend check?" Another salesperson shook his head, laughing while typing on the computer. Frank, unfazed by their tone, pulled the check from his pocket and held it up. "Here it is. It's enough to cover the full price. I don't need financing or discounts." For a moment, the showroom fell silent. The salesperson who was helping him looked at the check, but made no move to accept it. Instead, he turned and gestured toward the door, theatrically saying, "Sir, please follow me." Confused, Frank followed the man to the exit. When they reached the door, the salesperson gestured as if making way for him and declared, "Maybe you'll find something at the used car lot just over there. Tell them I sent you. Maybe they'll have something more suitable for someone like you." Laughter echoed again inside the showroom as Frank stood there, processing what had just happened. He looked at the salesperson for a moment, as if trying to understand why he was being treated this way. But instead of arguing or confronting him, he simply nodded, put the check back in his pocket, and started walking toward his old Ford. As he walked away, silence filled the showroom. Frank's dignified posture seemed to weigh on everyone watching him, but none of the staff dared say anything further. Outside, he got into his car, closed the door, and gripped the steering wheel for a few seconds, taking a deep breath. The pain of humiliation was evident. It wasn't just about the car. It was about the disrespect, the prejudice, the lack of empathy. He looked at the check in his hands and thought of Susan, about how sad she would have been to see what had happened. But Frank wasn't the kind of man to dwell on things for too long. As he started the engine of his old Ford, his thoughts began to shift. He knew this wasn't going to end there. Something in his face had changed. That experience had left a mark. What he would do next would be a response that no one at that dealership would ever forget. You'll be amazed at what happens next. Don't forget to like the video so YouTube will show you more gripping stories like this one. Now let's continue because the best is yet to come. That night, Frank arrived home earlier than usual. He didn't feel like turning on the TV or making coffee as he usually did. The weight of the day's humiliation still echoed in his mind. He hung his hat on the door hook, sat in the old armchair by the fireplace, and looked around the silent room. On the small sideboard in front of him was an old photo. He picked it up carefully and ran his fingers over the dusty glass. It was a picture of him and Susan, taken many years ago. The two were standing beside a sports car similar to the one he had admired at the dealership. They were smiling, full of plans and dreams, even while living a life that was never easy. "You always believed in people, didn't you, Susan?" Frank murmured to the photo. "Even in moments when everything seemed to go wrong, you always told me that kindness would prevail. Today, I saw the opposite." He leaned back in his chair, reliving memories of difficult times filled with lessons. Frank and Susan had faced financial losses, health crises, and the challenge of building a dignified life with little. For years, he worked as a mechanic, often repairing cars for customers who couldn't pay immediately. Susan, a teacher, never hesitated to help children with school supplies when their families couldn't afford them. "It wasn't easy, but we did everything with the right heart, didn't we?" he continued, as if Susan could respond. He knew that even though she was no longer by his side, her strength lived within him. Looking at the check still in his shirt pocket, Frank felt indignation rising, not because of the car, but because of the disrespect he had experienced. He knew he couldn't change what had happened that day, but he also wouldn't let it define what he did next. Frank placed the photo back on the sideboard and walked over to the desk, where he kept some important papers. He opened a drawer, pulled out a sealed envelope, and looked at it for a moment. "Tomorrow they'll learn what it means to treat people with dignity." Inside the envelope were documents revealing something no one at the dealership knew. Frank was the primary investor in the chain of stores. Years earlier, after inheriting a modest sum from Susan, he had quietly invested in businesses that created jobs and helped local communities. The dealership chain was one of those ventures. Frank had always kept a low profile, preferring to let managers handle the business. He trusted that operations were running smoothly, but after what happened, he knew it was time to intervene. With the envelope in hand, Frank sat down again in the armchair. He closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and smiled slightly. The decision was made. The next morning, he would show everyone at that dealership that appearances don't define character and that respect should always come first. That morning, the atmosphere at the dealership was uneasy. Employees arrived for another day of work, only to be surprised by a message on the internal system. Everyone was to gather in the conference room immediately. The manager, visibly uncomfortable, asked that all customer interactions be put on hold and directed everyone to the meeting. "Do you know what's going on?" one of the salespeople asked a colleague. "No idea. Maybe it's about sales numbers. Or maybe they're announcing layoffs," the other responded, joking but clearly intrigued. Little by little, the room filled up. Salespeople, the receptionist, and even the intern were there, whispering guesses about the reason for the meeting. Some mentioned it was rare to see the owner of the company. He was known for operating several stores in the region, but rarely showed up at any of them. The manager entered the room and asked for silence, looking tense. Before he could say anything, the door opened again. Frank walked in, accompanied by 2 lawyers and 3 well-dressed executives. The reaction was immediate. Whispers spread through the room, and all eyes turned to the older man they had ridiculed the day before. The salespeople exchanged confused glances. Some tried to mask their surprise, but others were visibly uncomfortable. The same salesperson who had dismissed Frank the day before was sitting at the back of the room, trying to figure out what was happening. Frank walked to the center of the room, paused for a moment, and looked around. He held the envelope he had taken out the night before. His posture was calm but firm. Finally, he broke the silence. "Good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Bennett." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You probably don't remember me, but I was here yesterday." A murmur began among the attendees, but Frank raised his hand, asking for silence. "Yesterday, I came into this store as a customer. I wanted to buy a car I had dreamed of owning my entire life. Instead of being treated with respect, I was ridiculed and humiliated, not because of what I said, but because of how I looked." The manager started to open his mouth to explain, but Frank interrupted him with a calm yet firm gesture. "I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to explain who I am." Frank handed the envelope to the lawyers, who opened it and placed some documents on the table. "I am the primary investor in this dealership and all the other stores in this chain." The conference room was completely silent. Frank, now standing confidently and composed, began to outline the values he believed should form the foundation of any business: respect, empathy, and dignity. As he spoke, the employees' eyes stayed fixed on him, especially those who had ridiculed him the day before. "This company isn't just a place to sell cars," Frank said firmly. "It's a place where people should be treated with dignity, regardless of how they dress, where they come from, or how they appear. Respect is a non-negotiable value." He paused, looking directly at the employees who had mocked him the day before. "Unfortunately, yesterday I saw something I cannot accept." Frank gestured to the lawyers who began distributing documents. "The employees who demonstrated inappropriate behavior and disrespected not only me but the principles this company should uphold are being terminated immediately." The faces of the salespeople involved turned pale. The leader of the group, the same one who had shown Frank to the door with disdain, tried to argue, "Mr. Bennett, it was a misunderstanding. Frank raised his hand, calmly interrupting. "You had your chance yesterday and you chose to laugh instead of helping. I'm not here to listen to excuses. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." The papers were signed and the salespeople began packing their things, visibly embarrassed. The murmurs in the room grew louder as the other employees tried to process what was happening. Frank then turned to the intern, a young man named Eric, who was sitting in a corner of the room, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. Eric was known for his kind demeanor, always greeting customers with a smile, even when often ignored by his more experienced colleagues. "Eric," Frank said in a lighter yet serious tone. The young man looked up, surprised to be called by name. "Yesterday, you were the only one here who maintained respect and kindness. Even when everyone around you was making jokes, you did what was right, and that didn't go unnoticed." Eric opened his mouth to respond, but Frank continued, "Starting today, you will be the new manager of this store. I trust that your values and attitude will help create a better environment for everyone." The room erupted in murmurs of surprise. Eric stammered, "Mr. Bennett, I don't even know what to say. I don't have the experience to be a manager." "You have the most important thing," Frank said with a slight smile. "Respect for people. Experience you'll gain. But character is something no one can teach, and you've already shown you have plenty of it." As the other employees timidly applauded, Eric shook his head, still trying to absorb the responsibility he now carried, but determined to honor the trust Frank had placed in him. With the meeting coming to a close, Frank looked around the room one last time and said, "This place will change. Here we'll prioritize values, not prejudices. And I hope each of you remembers that respect is something that should never be lacking, whether with customers or colleagues." Frank left the room knowing he had done the right thing. Eric stood there for a moment, still processing the responsibility now on his shoulders, but determined to live up to the trust Frank had placed in him. That morning marked the beginning of a transformation at the dealership. Under Eric's leadership, the atmosphere became more welcoming, and Frank's example was etched in everyone's mind. Justice had been served, and the lesson was clear. Respect never goes out of style. Frank knew real change didn't end with firing a few employees or promoting Eric. He wanted something bigger, something that would leave a lasting impact not just on the company, but on the community. To him, true success was measured by how much you could give back to the world. A few days after the incident at the dealership, Frank gathered the company's executives to present his new vision. He started the meeting with a phrase that reflected everything he believed. "A company only has value if it values people." Frank explained that, from that moment on, part of the dealership chain's profits would be allocated to programs that help those in need. He announced the creation of a special fund to support veterans, like himself, who often struggled to rebuild their lives after military service. "I know what it's like to fight to build something from nothing. We're going to help those who have done so much for us," he said. But Frank didn't stop there. Inspired by the generous spirit of his late wife, Susan, he decided to expand the program's reach. In addition to veterans, the fund would also support needy families, providing scholarships for promising young people, housing assistance, and support for small local businesses. Susan always believed that education and opportunity were the greatest tools for transforming lives. "That will be our focus," Frank said, his eyes shining. The charity program quickly took shape. Frank made it a point to personally visit the communities benefiting from the program, driving his old 1990 Ford, which he now called his lucky car. He met families, spoke with young people, and listened to the stories of those striving to improve their lives. During each visit, he felt he was honoring Susan's legacy and the values they had shared throughout their lives. At the dealership, the impact was also noticeable. Under the leadership of Eric, the new manager, the atmosphere changed completely. Employees were trained not only in sales, but also in empathy and customer service. New hires were selected not just for their skills, but for their attitude and alignment with the company's values. Frank regularly visited the dealership and always made time to talk to the employees. Remember, he would say, everyone who walks through that door has a story. How you treat them can make all the difference in their lives. The charity program soon became one of the pillars of the company's culture, and other dealerships in the network began adopting similar initiatives. The local community noticed the change, and Frank Bennett's name became associated not just with luxury cars, but with generosity and social impact. Frank knew he couldn't change the entire world, but firmly believed that small actions could create significant transformations. He looked back at all he had accomplished and felt a profound sense of peace. It wasn't just about money or business. It was about leaving the world a little better than he found it. Thus, Frank Bennett's legacy grew, proving that true wealth lies in making a difference in people's lives. He turned humiliation into an opportunity to teach, inspire, and give back, creating a new beginning for everyone around him. A few weeks after the significant changes at the dealership and the positive impact of the charity program, Frank finally decided it was time to fulfill the dream that had brought him there, buying the sports car he and Susan had always imagined. This time, the purchase was entirely different. Eric, now the store manager, insisted on personally assisting Frank. "Mr. Bennett, it's an honor to help you with this," Eric said as he handed Frank the keys to the shiny car. "I promise no one here will ever forget the importance of treating others with respect." Frank smiled as he held the keys. The red, immaculate car was parked in front of the store, gleaming under the morning sun. "You know, Eric," Frank said, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder, "this car isn't just a dream come true. It's a reminder of everything Susan and I believed, that we should never give up on what matters to us." Frank drove the car out of the dealership, but instead of taking it home to park in the garage, he decided to do something special. He drove straight to one of the communities supported by the charity fund. There, children were mesmerized by the gleaming vehicle pulling up. They ran to greet him, and Frank made sure each of them had a chance to sit in the driver's seat. "This car isn't just mine," he would say. "It's a symbol that dreams can come true even when they seem far away." He repeated this gesture in various communities, visiting veterans, families, and young people who were beginning to transform their lives thanks to the program he created. Each visit was an opportunity to inspire and reinforce the idea that the true value of things lies not in what we own, but in the impact we leave on others. About a month after the charity program was implemented, Frank was following his usual routine of visiting the dealership to see how things were going under Eric's leadership. The store was visibly different. Employees seemed more motivated, the atmosphere was welcoming, and the local community was coming in not just to buy cars, but to learn about the transformation that had taken place there. While Frank was chatting with Eric in the office, a receptionist knocked on the door. "Mr. Bennett, there's a family here who would like to speak with you. They said it was thanks to the charity fund that they overcame a tough time." Frank was intrigued. "Please bring them in," he replied, adjusting his hat and standing up. A few minutes later, a woman in her 40s entered the room, accompanied by two small children and an older man. They appeared humble, but their faces radiated gratitude. The woman held an envelope in her hand, looking emotional. "Mr. Bennett, my name is Lisa. I don't know how to thank you for what you've done for my family," she began, her voice trembling. Frank smiled kindly. "Lisa, I just did what I thought was right. Tell me what happened." Lisa explained that after losing her husband in a workplace accident, she was left to support her two children and elderly father alone. "We were on the verge of losing our home," she said, tears welling up. "I was desperate, trying everything to find a job while taking care of my kids and my dad. That's when a social worker told me about your charity program." She paused, trying to hold back her tears. "It was thanks to the fund that we were able to pay our overdue rent and buy food. But it wasn't just that. With the financial support, I was able to take a technical course, and now I have a stable job. Frank listened intently, his eyes shining with emotion. He looked at the two boys who stood quietly, holding their mother's hands. "And you? Are you taking good care of your mom?" he asked with a smile. The boys nodded, and one of them replied shyly, "Thank you, Mr. Bennett. My mom smiles more now." The room fell silent for a moment until Lisa's father, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. "You didn't just help us financially. You gave our family hope. That's worth more than any money." Frank approached Lisa and firmly shook her hand. "I'm glad to know you're doing well. Knowing this program is making a difference is all I could ever ask for." Lisa then handed him the envelope she had been carrying. "This is a little letter my kids wrote for you. They wanted to thank you in their own way." Frank carefully took the envelope, promising to read it later. "Thank you, Lisa. You've inspired me more than you can imagine. Stay strong, and if you ever need anything, this dealership will always have its doors open for you." As the family left, Eric walked into the room, visibly moved. "This is more impactful than any car sale we've ever made," he said. Frank nodded. "Eric, this is what I want everyone to understand. When we help people, we create something far greater than a business. We create connections. We change lives." He put the letter in his pocket, promising to read it that night. For Frank, moments like that reinforced that true success wasn't in profits, but in the impact he could leave on people's lives. News about Frank Bennett and the transformation at his dealership spread like wildfire. The communities he helped, the charity fund that changed lives, and even the turnaround with the salespeople who had humiliated him drew the attention of many in the city. Soon his story reached a local TV station, which invited him for an interview on the most-watched morning show. On the day of the interview, Frank arrived at the studio with his usual simplicity. He parked the sports car in the station's lot, but not before letting kids from a nearby neighborhood take photos with it. With his old hat and serene smile, he greeted every member of the crew as if he had known them for years, quickly winning everyone over. The host, Mark Collins, known for his charisma, opened the show enthusiastically. "Today we have an incredible story to share. Frank Bennett, a man who has proven that the greatest acts of change can come from the humblest people. Mr. Bennett, welcome." Frank, live for the first time, adjusted his hat and smiled. "Thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here." Mark started with simple questions about his life before retirement and what brought him to the dealership on that fateful day. Frank, in his calm voice, answered candidly, "I wanted to buy the car my wife and I dreamed of since we were young. But what I found that day was something no money could buy, a lesson in respect and dignity." When asked how he felt about being treated with disdain, Frank paused. "It was painful," he admitted, "but what concerned me most was realizing that this attitude might be common there. I knew I had to do something, not out of revenge, but to ensure no one else went through what I did." Mark delved deeper into his decision to transform the company's culture and create the charity fund. "Mr. Bennett, what motivated you to take such a big step instead of simply walking away?" Frank looked into the camera, as if speaking directly to each viewer at home. "My wife, Susan, always believed that everyone has a responsibility to do what's right, even when no one is watching. I believe turning a negative experience into something positive is a way to honor the life we shared." Mark's eyes filled with admiration. "And the charity fund? What do you hope to achieve with it?" Frank replied, "I hope people understand that no one should face life's challenges alone. If each of us does a little to help others, the impact will be immense. It's not about wealth or status, it's about humanity." The highlight of the interview came when Mark asked, "If you could leave one message for everyone watching now, what would it be?" Frank smiled, adjusting the microphone. "Never judge someone by their appearance. Everyone has a story, a value that goes beyond what the eyes can see, and never underestimate the impact your kindness can have on someone's life. Small gestures can change the world." The interview ended with applause from the entire studio crew. After the show, Frank's story went viral on social media. Comments from people who felt inspired flooded the program's page. Many said the interview motivated them to treat others with more respect and to find ways to help their communities. Frank returned home that afternoon, still processing the impact of what had happened. He smiled as he saw a message on his phone from Eric saying, "Mr. Bennett, the store is packed today. People want to meet the man behind the story." Frank realized that his story wasn't just about him. It was about everyone who believed in the power of change and kindness. And as he watched the sunset that evening, he thought Susan would be proud. In the end, Frank lived the life he and Susan had always dreamed of. He didn't just buy the car, he made it a symbol of something much greater: humility, resilience, and the ability to transform the world around him with simple, meaningful actions. And every time he started the car's engine, he felt as if Susan were right there beside him, smiling and saying, "You did it, Bennett, you did it." If you've made it this far, comment below, "I read until the end." Share this story and help spread this emotion to more people. Just click share and let this impressive story reach others.